Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in a weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole eventually gets us to plant people, woolly mammoths, and whether apes are people.
Ape better than human.
But, as always, we have to get there. Before we start, I just want to let you know about a new course that I'm starting called DIY Rabbit Hole. One of the things that I've hoped to accomplish with this series is that it might inspire other people to dig their own rabbit holes. And since I started this at the beginning of the year, a number of people have reached out to me asking if I'd consider teaching a course in how to do that. I won't say what that number is, but it's bigger than 3. Anyways, that's what this course is. It's 1 month, 4 weekly Zoom classes, plus a one-on-one Zoom session where we can talk about your ideas and questions. So, if you'd like to become an ordained rabbit, go to creativejudaism.com/DIY and sign up for the course. Alright, let's get started. This week's Torah portion, Parshas Kedoshim, has a lot of mitzvahs in it, and among them is a prohibition against employing the services of certain types of sorcerers, namely the Oiv and the Ydua. Rashi, as always, gives us some detail as to what these things are. He explains that the Oiv is someone who makes the voice of a spirit speak through his armpit, and the Ydua is someone who puts the bone of an animal called a Ydua in their mouth, and the bone speaks.
It's a classic necromancer scam.
So, as fascinating as this magic stuff is, that's not the rabbit hole. The rabbit hole is that animal that Rashi mentioned that the bone comes from, the Ydua. Rashi doesn't explain what the Ydua is there, and neither does the Gemara that he's quoting from. But many other commentaries do identify the Ydua as creatures that are also known as the Adasada. As far as I can tell, the earliest source that makes this connection and gives us some details about this creature is Rabbeinu Shimshon of Shantz, one of the Bali Tosfos who lived in France in the 1100s. In his commentary on a Mishnah that mentions the Adasada, he says that he heard in the name of another rabbi that the Adasada are the Ydua, which is used for the Ydua practice mentioned in the Torah, and that this creature grows from a vine and comes out of the ground like cucumbers and pumpkins. But other than that, the Ydua has a completely human form, and has a human face and human body and human hands and human feet. And it's connected to this cord or vine at its navel. So it's basically an umbilical vine that connects back to the roots in the ground. And then he continues and tells us that this creature is incredibly dangerous and nothing can get near it because it eats everything it can reach within the radius of its cord. And that's how it survives, just by grazing within that radius. And when people hunt it, they can't get close. They have to target the cord at the navel until it breaks and the creature immediately dies. So this is something that I've been fascinated with forever. A ferocious plant monster that's hunted for its magical properties.
I'm starving!
I've actually been trying to work this into a rabbit hole since the beginning of the year. I thought that maybe the Mandrake episode might have gotten us there, but it didn't. So now that the Ydua is finally mentioned in the Parshah, I was really excited to finally get the opportunity to dig into the topic of the Adasada, and I found lots of cool stuff that I had never seen before. So that's where this week's rabbit hole starts, with the Adasada, or the Ydua, a strange monster that grows from the ground. If you're ready to see where that takes us, let's dive in. Okay, so I said earlier that the Adasada are mentioned in a Mishnah, and as far as I can tell, this is the earliest time that they show up, but without all the details we get in later sources. The Mishnah is categorizing various animals in terms of their status with regard to various animal-related laws, and it says that the Adasada is a chaya, a wild animal, which has ramifications for certain laws that I'm not going to get into right now. But then it says that according to Rabbi Yossi, the Adasada are metame ba'oil, which means that being in the same room as the dead body of it makes a person ritually impure. And then it goes on to other animals and doesn't say anything more about the Adasada. But this idea that their corpse can transmit impurity by being in the same room is a big deal, because this is a law that only applies to the bodies of human beings. No other animal transmits impurity this way.
That is what makes you so fabulously human.
So, even though the Mishnah doesn't explicitly give us any details about the Adasada, it indirectly tells us something huge, that these creatures are human-like, enough at least that, according to Rabbi Yossi, they have a halachic status that is uniquely human. So, that's the first inkling we get that these creatures are something special, something different than regular animals. But the Talmud Yerushalmi gives us even more information in its discussion of that Mishnah. It refers to them as Avne Hasada with a vase instead of Adne Hasada, the way we've been saying it with a dalid. There are explanations for both versions of the word, but they're technical and I won't get into it here. But Avne Hasada is a phrase that comes from Iyov, or Job, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But for now, all we need to know is that Avne Hasada means the same thing as Adne Hasada here, because the Talmud Yerushalmi is clearly talking about that Mishnah. And it tells us that the Avne Hasada is a Barnash de Tur, a mountain man, and its life comes from its navel, and if you cut its navel, it can't live. So this seems to be the earliest source for the idea that the Adne Hasada are creatures that grow from the ground. But the added details about their eating habits and stuff, and the idea that it's the same thing as the Ydua that's used for magic, that stuff shows up later in the Middle Ages. But this piece from the Talmud Yerushalmi is kind of where all of that starts. And it gives us the term mountain man, which is fun.
Oh, okay. He's a creepy wilderness man. Gotcha.
But what about that source in Iyov that I told you about? After I saw this mention of the Adne Hasada as the Avne Hasada, I searched up the verse that phrase comes from, and this is what it says. For you will have a pact with the Avne Hasada, and the Chayas Hasada will be your allies. Avne Hasada literally translates as the stones of the field, and Chayas Hasada means the beasts of the field. But, according to Rashi, the Avne Hasada are a type of person. So maybe that's our pumpkin people.
This is the time of year to write to the great pumpkin.
But in his very next commentary on the phrase Chayas Hasada, the beasts of the field, he says that this is not just any beasts of the field, but a particular beast, which he translates into French as grossa or something like that. The translations of Rashi here also aren't sure what it means. But he continues and says that this is a true beast of the field, and that in the language of the Mishnah, it's called Adne Hasada. So according to this, the Avne Hasada are a type of man, and the Chayas Hasada are the Adne Hasada. It's a little bit confusing, so let's try to sort through it a little bit. It could be that Rashi's saying that the verse is talking about the same thing, but with two different terms, Avne Hasada and Chayas Hasada. Or he could be saying that we're talking about two different things, which just so happen to have similar names, Avne Hasada and Adne Hasada. And I wasn't able to find any sources that clarified that. But the really interesting thing here is that mystery French word.
Baguette.
According to Oitzer Laze Rashi, which is a modern dictionary of the medieval French words that Rashi sprinkles throughout his commentaries, it says that this word is connected to folk tales about people who turn into wolves. Which means, according to this theory, Rashi is saying that the Adne Hasada are werewolves.
Werewolf for mitzvah, spooky, scary. Boys becoming men, men becoming wolves.
So now we've got two completely different possible definitions of the Adne Hasada, and both are awesome. Pumpkin people or werewolves. But those aren't the only possibilities. When I was digging around for stuff about the Adne Hasada, I saw a few English translations that translated it as orangutans, which was weird because that's completely different. At that point, I hadn't seen the werewolf thing yet, and the only definition of Adne Hasada that I was aware of was the plant people. So I was very surprised to see it translated as something completely different and completely normal, like not a monster. So I dug around, and the source for that translation seems to be Rambam's commentary on that Mishnah about the dead body of the Adne Hasada making people impure the way that a human body does. But when I looked at it, it doesn't seem like Rambam is talking about an orangutan there. Here's how he describes the Adne Hasada. He says that they're wild animals that resemble human beings. Okay, that's sounding kind of orangutan-y. But then he continues that there are stories told of them that they speak many words, but it's unintelligible, but their speech is similar to human speech. And then he tells us that in Arabic, it's called al-nasnas, and it's written about extensively in books. So at first I thought maybe it could still be orangutans, and that thing about them having human-like speech was somehow a reference to the possible language abilities of apes. But Rambam actually tells us exactly what he's talking about. Remember that Arabic word, al-nasnas? Turns out that it's a monster that shows up a lot in Arab folklore.
Perhaps you would like to hear the tale?
Just as Rambam said. And then it's a human-like creature that hops around on one leg. Here's a closer look at that picture of them, which is delightful. But it kind of feels like a missed opportunity to draw them in profile, where you only see one leg anyways. So now we've got three possibilities for the Adne Hasada. Pumpkin people, werewolves, and monopods. But let's not completely rule out apes.
Nobody wants me.
Malbim mentions the Adne Hasada in a different context that I'm not going to get into here, but he says that according to Rambam, they are the forest man, which is either the orangutan or the chimpanzee. Now, I think it's worth noting that the word orangutan comes from two words that actually mean forest man, which is maybe what Malbim was referring to. But forest man also sounds a lot like field man, which is what Adasada means, which is an interesting connection for the argument that Adasada are orangutans. Okay, before we move on from orangutans, I want to talk about one more thing, which is great ape personhood. It's the idea that apes should be considered people and be granted human rights and maybe even the rights of citizenship. Jane Goodall is one of the proponents of this movement, and there have been a lot of legal efforts to codify this into law in various places.
This is very challenging to some people who want to cling to the fact that only humans can be persons. They're more like us than anything else. They deserve to be treated with respect.
But according to the opinion that Adnei Hasada are orangutans, then our Mishnah about the body of the Adnei Hasada having the same unique halacha as the body of a human being would be the earliest legal ruling giving apes the status of people, at least in one very specific way, which I think is fun. So now we've got 4 possibilities for the identity of the Adnei Hasada: pumpkin people, werewolves, monopods, and orangutans. Okay, let's get back to the pumpkin people.
How's it hanging? I'm David Pumpkins.
The guys that are tethered to the ground by their umbilical cord and eat anything in its radius. The Tiferes Yisrael, in his commentary on that Mishnah, discusses this possibility and ultimately rejects it in favor of orangutans.
They were orangutans, hard-working, patriotic orangutans.
But before he gets there, he mentions some possible problems with the pumpkin people that he says aren't really a problem. So he asks questions and then answers them so that he can get to his main problem and then not answer it. So here's one of those questions that he asks and answers. He says, you shouldn't be bothered by the fact that such a creature isn't mentioned in history books, because there are many creatures who were lost to history, but their bones have been discovered in the depths of the earth, such as the mammoth. So he proposes it could be that because these plant monster people were so dangerous, ancient humans deliberately drove them to extinction. So according to this, maybe there are Adnei Hasada bones buried in the earth. But I wouldn't go looking for them because I might be tempted to use them for magic. Okay, so in that commentary from the Tiferes Yisrael, while he's talking about how dangerous these creatures are described, he mentions a book called Maaseh Tuvia, which I hadn't heard of before. So I did some digging and discovered that it's a Jewish science text published in the early 1700s, and apparently it's famous for this illustration of human anatomy compared to a house. I had never seen that before, and even though it's not related to our topic, I thought it was really cool and I wanted to share it with you. I particularly like how the house has a face. Anyways, in Maaseh Tuvia, there's a section where he's discussing the Adnei Hasada as the scary plant monster people. And he mentioned some of the sources we looked at earlier, but then he offers another possibility. He says that there's a new geography book which tells of creatures from the province of Sambulala in Tartary. He refers to the people of Tartary as African, but Tartary is actually in Asia and includes Siberia. Anyways, he says, this creature grows from seeds, like pumpkin seeds, but smaller, which sprout vines or cords that grow to the navel of an animal called the baramets, which means sheep in their language, because it looks exactly like a sheep from head to toe. It has cloven hooves, soft skin, and wool that's good for making clothes. It doesn't have horns, but the hair on its head grows into the shape of horns. And the sheep can grow to about half an amma or taller, which is about 9 inches. Then he continues, according to the people who have seen this creature, its meat tastes like fish and its blood is as sweet as honey. It lives as long as there's grass within reach of its vine, and if the grass is cut or dies out, the animal also dies. And finally, one more detail, it has no natural predators except for the wolf, which is always trying to eat it. So this is very exciting, a sheep that grows on a vine. And I'm simultaneously delighted by and disturbed by the imagery of this poor thing running around in circles trying to get away from a wolf. But while I was digging around trying to find out what Tartary is, I found out that this creature is actually pretty well known, and even has its own Wikipedia page. It's called the Vegetable Lamb of Tartary, and there are lots of wonderful images of what people thought it looked like. That Wikipedia page also taught me a new word, zoophyte, which means a half-plant, half-animal creature. So now we've got 5 possibilities for what the Adnei Hasada are. Pumpkin people, werewolves, monopods, orangutans, and vegetable lambs. 2 of which are zoophytes. Okay, so there's one more thing about the Adnei Hasada that I was kind of on the fence about including. There's an idea in Kabbalah, and it comes up a few times in Hasidus as well, that the Adnei Hasada are the mamutza, the intermediary or bridge between plant and animal. They're animals because they can move around and eat and stuff, but they're also kind of plants because they're connected to the ground and are nourished through their umbilical cord vine.
That's not how umbilical cords work.
And that's an interesting idea, but I wasn't sure if it fit, until I saw a tiny little footnote from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But before I share that, let me give you a little background. There's a verse later in the Torah, in Devarim, or Deuteronomy, that's talking about war, and it says that when you conquer a city, you shouldn't cut down trees. And it asks rhetorically, Ki ha'adam Adasada, is a tree a person? In other words, the people are the enemy, not the trees, which is a fascinating concept on its own, and maybe we'll get into it more when we get there. But what's relevant here is that the Talmud uses this verse literally to learn how human beings are like trees. And this is something that's very popular to quote on Tu B'Shvat, the New Year for trees. Anyways, the Rebbe asked about the way that the Talmud compares people to trees, and that it's different than the way people are compared to other things in other places, and he asks what's so special about this comparison. I'm not going to get into the whole question and answer because, like I said, this is about the footnote, so I'm just going to share the part that gets us there. The Rebbe starts talking about what the unique positive quality of plants is as compared to animals and human beings. And he says that the unique quality of plants is that they don't hide the fact that their life force comes from the ground. Ultimately, everything, even animals and people, get their life from the ground, but with plants, it's out in the open. They're tethered to the ground, and if you take them out, they die. But animals and humans aren't connected to their source physically, so they don't overtly illustrate that connection. And that's where the footnote comes in. The Rebbe points out this idea that the Adasada are the intermediary between plants and animals. And that's it. That's the entire footnote. Which at first I thought was kind of uneventful. I was doing a search for Adasada, this came up, I thought maybe there would be something interesting there, and then I saw it and thought maybe it wasn't so interesting. The Adasada are mentioned there, but it doesn't seem to be anything new or exciting. But then I thought that this actually kind of undermines the point that the Rebbe is trying to make, that plants have something that animals and people don't have. But then he gives us an example of an animal that does have that quality, which isn't rare. There's a lot of instances where the Rebbe points out things that could contradict a point that he's making, and sometimes he'll explain why it doesn't, and other times he'll just leave it there. So maybe this footnote could be that. But then it occurred to me that there's a way that the Adasada actually makes the point even stronger. See, this idea of a mamutza, a bridge or an intermediary between two things, the way it works in Kabbalah is that it has to have the best of both things. That's the only way it can be a real bridge between the two. Which means that when it says that the Adasada are the bridge between plants and animals, it doesn't just mean that it's a link in the chain that gets us one step closer, it means it's got the unique strengths of an animal and the unique strengths of a plant. It's an animal, so it can move around and do all sorts of things that plants can't do, but it's also a plant in that it's connected to the ground and openly illustrates its connection to its source of life, which animals can't do. And that's really cool to me because up until that point, I had been thinking about the pumpkin people's umbilical vine as a limitation. It can only graze within the limitations of its vine, and also the vine is a vulnerability. If it gets severed, the creature dies. And in the case of the vegetable lamb version of this creature, it makes it difficult for it to run away from wolves. So that seems like a limitation and a vulnerability. But that footnote made me think about it as a strength. In one particular way, and maybe even in the most important way, the pumpkin people's umbilical vine makes them even better than animals or even than human beings. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. Just a reminder again, if you like this style of exploring Torah and you'd like to try doing it yourself, go to creativejudaism.com/DIY and sign up for the DIY Rabbit Hole course. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. Be careful not to step on any plants down here. The plants might be animals.